A lot that's been happening as far as the US tariffs on India are concerned, and of course, the kind of repercussions that we've been seeing internationally. How different is this from the experience of other countries, many of which have actually succumbed to the hard bargaining tactics that have been used by President Trump? To talk about this, joining me at the moment is Laurie Laird, who's a well-known economic affairs commentator. Thank you so much, Laurie, for speaking to Times Now.
And let me begin.
Let me begin by asking you how you've argued that Donald Trump's steep tariffs on India may not be as damaging as they sound, pointing out that India is still growing at around 7% annually, with sectors like pharmaceuticals and jewelry, which are largely shielded. At the same time, you've also noted that India's continued purchases of discounted Russian oil, despite the pressure coming in from US, have complicated the long-standing US-India partnership. How do you reconcile this apparent resilience in the Indian economy with the growing strain on the relationship with Washington?
My God, what a complex question there. But let's start with the assertion that perhaps these tariffs, as dramatic as they sound, 50% on some Indian goods. Look, I don't want to sound glib when I say that this isn't going to greatly trouble the Indian economy. There will be some sectors that will be hurt, and I don't want to undermine that. But when you have an economy growing by 7.8%, as India did in the second quarter, that's over the same quarter a year earlier, the feeling is that at most that these tariffs could take almost a percentage point off Indian growth. That doesn't mean it's not going to hurt somewhere, but it's not going to be India collapsing for a couple of reasons. India isn't a huge exporter, and the things that are most important to the U.S., not surprisingly, Donald Trump has carved out pharmaceutical products, electronic products. They will not be subject to those tariffs because Donald Trump doesn't want to hurt his own economy, right? Some areas, jewelry, that will be hit. Textiles could be hit quite badly, footwear. So there will be some pain in pockets of the economy, but in aggregate, and economists have to be really careful when we talk about economies in aggregate, because there will be pockets that are going to suffer.
But you also observe that we're not seeing from Modi what we've seen from the EU. Don't tariff us and we'll buy more US gas. Now, Prime Minister Modi is not playing that game at all, is what you've said. How significant is this difference in the negotiation styles of both? And what does that tell us about India's growing confidence in asserting its own economic sovereignty?
Fascinating, isn't it? Because you mentioned the EU, worth mentioning because Ursula von der Leyen, who's the head of the European Commission, made a mad dash to Scotland when Donald Trump was here in the UK for a golfing tournament, made a lot of concessions on behalf of the European Union. And privately, some of the countries in the European Union are pretty cross that von der Leyen made those concessions. She negotiates trade on behalf of all of the countries in the Eurozone. So there's not necessarily a consensus on how much to offer Donald Trump. You're absolutely right. Narendra Modi said, wait a second, I'm not going to negotiate. This doesn't seem fair. And one thing that hasn't been discussed all that much is exactly what India is doing wrong in terms of buying Russian oil. Now, the scheme by which countries are allowed to buy Russian crude was set up by the G7. The U.S. is the dominant member of the group of 7 nations. And what that rule says is that people are free to buy Russian crude oil as long as they don't pay more than $60 a barrel for that oil. As far as I can see, India is largely complying with that. Other countries are doing the same thing. So why India was singled out is a bit of a mystery, particularly because, you mentioned the geopolitics. Look, in Donald Trump's first term, these two men were, seemed to have a fantastic relationship, right? They, when Modi visited the U.S., they had the Howdy Modi, event in Texas. 50,000 people went to see Modi in Texas. 50,000 people packed out Madison Square Garden, a massive sporting hall in Manhattan. Donald Trump went to Gujarat. Apparently, the crowds were this Namaste Trump program. Crowds of 100,000 went to see these guys. So they had this political double act that almost looked like some kind of rock event or sport event. So how they've fallen out, you tell me, what's going on? Why has Modi gone off Trump? Why isn't he playing Trump's game?
I think, we don't know. There could be any number of explanations, including Trump sort of referring to the fact that he solved, the crisis between India and Pakistan when they were at war,
Sure.
and Modi telling our parliament that there was no third-party interference, given that being the position of India for the last several decades, that whatever happens between India and Pakistan is purely a bilateral issue. So there is certainly, of course, a lot of speculation. If there's something else that's happened, we certainly don't know about it, and we'll perhaps have to wait for it.
Let me know if you find
Yeah.
out, because this falling out is quite dramatic, isn't
Yes,
it?
but absolutely. And I want you to come in on some of the things that you've been saying, because the kind of noises that we are hearing from Washington, for instance, that India and Russia were dead economies, the trade between US and India is a one-sided disaster, and so on and so forth. But you've actually come out to say that India is a fairly closed economy and it doesn't send that much to the US. Why would you say so? Because the feeling in US is that the trade is completely, imbalanced and one-sided.
Well, look, America has imbalanced trade in goods as separate from services with a number of countries. Now, why Donald Trump seems that a bilateral goods deficit with any country is necessarily an economic emergency. And that is the premise that he has used to enact some of these tariffs. Why he thinks that it's an emergency is something that I cannot get my head around. The fact that America has these bilateral deficits in goods could be an indication of strength in the U.S. economy. This means American consumers have enough money to buy things from abroad. But I think I'd like to repeat something I said at the outset, which is that the administration, the U.S. administration, was very clever in exempting things that Americans really need, like generic pharmaceuticals that Americans rely quite heavily on. That has been carved out. Electronic devices, because shortly after, when China was in Trump's sights, Tim Cook, who is the head of Apple, openly spoke about moving some of the Chinese production to India. And you'll notice that Donald Trump, and this is shortly after Tim Cook brought him a present in the Oval Office, Donald Trump exempted iPhone's electronic equipment as well. So this is certainly a rather loose agreement, and it certainly is looking at not taxing things that Americans tend to buy. But India is a unique economy compared to some of its neighbors in that India is very reliant on domestic demand. About 60% of GDP is due to domestic demand. It is not so reliant on exports the way that, say, Bangladesh or some of the economies further east are, like China or Malaysia. So that will shield India to a certain extent. The other thing that will help shield India is India does very well in trading services. So when Donald Trump talks about trade, he's talking about goods. He's talking about things that we can hold, electronics, trainers. India does very well in exporting computer information services.
So, the big question that many are asking is, of course, like you rightly said, there are certain sectors that will be impacted. The Indian economy itself, of course, is resilient. But how easy will it for India to diversify, because the concentrated hit will be there on certain industries like apparel, footwear, etc. There could be long-term job losses that could have its own impact here in India. But there is also a section that says that India is going to look at other markets, whether Asia, whether Europe, to try and do business with and try and pivot some of those exports. What is your guess on that?
Well, I think that where India may have a competitive advantage in some ways is internal investment. A lot of big multinational corporations would love a crack at the Indian market. It is the biggest consumer market in the world. There is very much a growing middle class. Your Prime Minister Modi has recently implemented some tax changes that frees up income for middle classes to spend more on goods. A lot of multinationals would like to get into India. It's a very attractive market. What has concerned and what has held some of these multinationals back is a lack of, confidence in the tax regime. Over the past decade, there have been a number of foreign companies that have retroactively got into tax trouble with the Indian government. Vodafone, the telecoms company, springs to mind. And I think that is one of the things that is holding India's growth back in terms of being an international player. And I think international investors would like to have more clarity, more certainty on the long-term tax regime in India.
Right. But there are also, of course, many people who are looking at the entire argument as far as, India purchasing Russian oil, which is said to be one of the reasons for the extra 25% tariff that India is supposed to pay, which is that this is really fueling the Russian war. But what the US doesn't seem to get is that on the one hand, you have China that purchases far more oil. You have EU as well that purchases far more natural gas. And US itself is doing business with Russia to the tune of $2.5 billion in terms of purchasing uranium and plutonium and so on and so forth. So the hypocrisy is something that's being viewed with a lot of puzzlement over here as to what exactly is US trying to say and why is it singling out India when there are so many other precedents of others doing business with Russia.
Look, I completely agree with you that there's a bit of cognitive dissonance going on with U.S. foreign policy. It's incredibly confusing. I mean, one thing, if we go back to the European Union, one thing that the EU did to try and sort of butter up Donald Trump was to promise to buy more, particularly more U.S. oil and more U.S. LNG, liquefied natural gas. This is a really bizarre pledge because the companies that buy U.S. energy in the European Union, these aren't state companies. These aren't EU companies. These are private companies owned by private shareholders. So when the head of the European Commission says, sure, we'll buy more U.S. gas. Sure, we'll do that, whatever you want. She cannot implement that on her own. She cannot tell EU companies to buy more U.S. energy. So that promise, well, it may have got lower tariff rates for the EU. It's impossible to implement. Yet Modi very wisely is not saying, he's not promising things that he can't implement. I think America needs to look a little bit more closely, and you mentioned this a few moments ago. What's happening geopolitically here? We had Modi in China for the first time in 7 years. We thought what we had was an intractable problem between China and India. And all of a sudden, we're seeing Modi, kind of shaking hands and looking pleasantly with Chinese President Xi Jinping. This is not, I don't think, what America intended. And, India has made much of its non-alignment. But now I think with India and other developing nations seeing that perhaps America is not that reliable a partner, looking toward the East. I mean, America's withdrawal from what many people would call the rules-based international order has created a real opening for China.
Right. And, this is also very interesting because you have a series of statements coming in from several top officials in the Trump administration, which are being perceived as not just undiplomatic, but also perhaps derogatory. You have, for instance, Peter Navarro, who's, of course, the envoy for trade, or the advisor for trade, rather, who's come out to make comments such as there are Brahmins profiteering, in India if India is going to bed with Russia. He's also come out to call the Russia-Ukraine war Modi's war, so on and so forth. There is a series of such statements coming in. What do you make of these comments that are coming in, which are rather uncharacteristic?
Well, I think Peter Navarro, he was the trade advisor to Trump in the first administration. He doesn't seem to be influencing things as much as he did in the first administration. That's not to say that some of the trade statements that are coming out of the U.S. are nonsensical. For Trump to say that India is a dead economy, well, you're not a dead economy if you're growing by almost 8% year on year. And by the way, inflation in India is under 2%, way, way below where it is in the U.S. And of course, that Donald Trump has been very critical of the U.S. central bank for not reducing interest rates. So the Indian economy, while there are things that can improve, looks pretty darn healthy to me. So saying it's a dead economy is absolutely nonsensical. But it just belies any sort of deep understanding of what's happening in South Asia. And Donald Trump, very early in his tenure, second time around, got rid of a lot of high-level people in the State Department. Many of the Russia team have all gone. Also, people who spent careers looking at South Asia. And I think that lack of institutional knowledge is really showing right now.
Right. Laurie, there's also another irony or hypocrisy or incongruency, whatever one chooses to call it, when it comes to the U.S. trade deficit, which is said to be the reason that these tariffs are there in the first place. There are at least 9 countries which actually have a higher trade deficit with the U.S. than with India. Yet 7 of those countries are facing much lower tariffs. How do you explain this mismatch? Are you getting any understanding from the Trump administration as to whether this is more about political signaling than about economic logic?
Look, all of the words that you chose, incongruity, hypocrisy, perhaps, all of those seem right to me. Can no longer deny as a political tool, look, goods surplus with Brazil. Brazil is facing tariffs that are almost as high as India is, again, with carve outs for things like orange juice that Americans actually buy and some agricultural products. And Donald Trump has very clearly said that this is because he believes that the former Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, is being prosecuted unfairly. Bolsonaro is being prosecuted for an uprising after he lost a presidential election. Sounds a bit familiar there, right? Now, Trump has been very clear that he has a political objective in imposing these tariffs on Brazil. Now, one of the things that frustrates me, befuddles me, is that many of these tariffs have been imposed under emergency powers. Now, a court has recently thrown questions on that, but that standing holds until the middle of October. How can you how can you say America is facing an economic emergency, yet go on to say that we are imposing tariffs, or in the case of Brazil or India, for political reasons? Doesn't that abrogate the notion that these tariffs are being imposed because there is an emergency? Furthermore, Donald Trump loves to stand up and says America's the hottest country in the world. Either you have the hottest economy or you're facing an economic emergency. But I fail to see how both these things can be true at the same time.
Right. What would happen as somebody who looks at the entire world of international economics very closely? What would happen if India actually takes US's advice and decides to stop buying Russian oil? What's the impact that you see having, for instance, on prices or the global oil purchases, for instance?
I'm so glad you brought this up, and I'm so glad we didn't overlook this point, because this strategy also goes against another kind of U.S. objective, which is to bring down the price of energy. So say India buys somewhere between 1 million and 2 million barrels of crude oil a day from Russia. Over the past month or so, that's sort of trended down a little bit. So say India were to go elsewhere for that oil. That means that another 1 to 2 million barrels a day have to be found from somewhere. And that will, if you increase demand and decrease supply, well, what happens to the price? The price goes up. So we're India to say, okay, we're going to buy this elsewhere. We'll buy it from Texas, for heaven's sake. That will increase the price of oil, which is directly opposed to one of Donald Trump's objectives, which is to bring down energy prices. Energy prices, particularly the price of a gallon of petrol or a gallon of gas in American parlance, is a really emotive metric. It's sort of in your face. When Americans are driving down the road, you'll see the price of what it costs to fill your tank on every road sign. So it's something that Americans buy day in and day out. So it's a real metric they use to evaluate the state of the economy. And so Donald Trump is very sensitive to that. Oil prices, motoring fuel prices will increase if India were to turn around and say, okay, we're not going to buy that Russian oil anymore.
Absolutely. And you've also stated that losing Modi as an ally may turn out to be quite a mistake for the US. What are the risks for Washington if India indeed deepens its defense and energy ties further with Russia and China, while the US, as you noted, is simultaneously developing close relationships with Pakistan? Former NSA Jake Sullivan, for instance, says that this is because of the crypto deal that certain members of the Trump family have done with Pakistan, and he has said that this is adversely impacting ties between US and India. What's your view on this?
Look, Jake Sullivan, who was a national security advisor under Biden, is a pretty smart guy. And certainly the Trump family has talked to the government of Pakistan about deepening financial ties, deepening cooperation in the crypto area. It was peculiar to see the top Pakistani military official lunching at the White House not that long ago. You don't tend to see, head of state and military ties with any country, right? I mean, that was really, really quite unusual. But successive U.S. administrations, going back to the second George Bush, really did try and court India as a bulwark against China. It's a very big, very populous, very well-armed country in a strategic area of the world. It makes sense to work constructively with India. And there was a lot of, faffing, toing, and froing about relaxing some of the military kit that the U.S. could send to India. That relationship was developing slowly, but it was developing. That seems to have ground to a halt. And I don't think there's anyone who doesn't have some concerns about China's military posture, China's attitude toward Taiwan. Not engaging with India when you have a aspiring power with the world's biggest military just sitting a little bit further to the east seems very, very odd to me. And this really is downgrading what has been a long-term U.S. geopolitical strategy.
All right. Laurie Laird, thank you so much for taking the time out and analyzing all of
My
those
pleasure.
tricky questions here with us at Times Now.